Today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations by factoring. First, I'm going to take a moment to say that if you have not watched the lesson 5.5 on factoring when a is greater than 1, then go do that before watching this video because this one will only make sense if you know how to factor. But going on to solving a quadratic equation by factoring, we first need to know what a quadratic equation is. So a quadratic expression is an expression containing a squared variable. That's what we were using in lesson 5.5 because we weren't setting it equal to anything. A quadratic equation is an equation that contains a squared variable. And a quadratic equation that is in standard form looks like this: ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So that's what our three definitions right here are telling us. We know what a quadratic expression is, a quadratic equation, and standard form of the quadratic equation. When we are going to factor a quadratic equation in order to solve for it, we are just doing exactly what we always do when we solve for a variable. The idea is we want to rearrange this equation so that x is on a side by itself. It's just a little bit different because now we are working with this exponent of 2 on our variable. So what we're going to do is a couple of things. I have my steps written down here and I'm going to use this example to go through it. I'm also going to reference the notes from yesterday and the factoring quadratics flowchart. So this problem is on page 155 and it is example number 2. Step 1 says to arrange the equation to be in standard form. So I want the first term to be my term with the x squared in it, my second term to be the term with x in it, my constant needs to be third, and then it needs to equal 0. This is not in standard form, so I'm going to rearrange it so that it is. This side that has a 14 on it, we want to just be a 0. So I'm going to subtract 14 from both sides, and I get 4x squared minus 26x minus 14 equals 0. Now it is in standard form. I'm going to go on to step number 2. Step number 2 says factor the polynomial and rewrite the equation. This is a really loaded step because we have to use what we learned in lessons 5.4 and 5.5 in order to factor the polynomial. I wrote this little note down here: use the flowchart and or the box method learned in lesson 5.5. So this is what our flowchart looked like. This flowchart tells me what steps to take and when. So first I'm going to ask myself, is there a GCF? In this equation, there is a GCF, and the GCF is 2. So what I'm going to do is factor out the number 2. Oops. If you do not factor out the number 2, then it's not going to be correct. So we have 2 on the outside of parentheses, 2x squared minus 13x minus 7 equals 0. I'm just going to write this down here since I squished it there. Now that I took out the GCF, so we said yes, factored it to the outside of the parentheses, now I'm looking, is it a difference of squares? It is not a difference of squares. There are 3 terms, and remember from lesson 5.4, difference of squares is just 2 terms. So that's not what it is. So I'm going to say nope. It's asking, are there 3 terms inside parentheses? There are 3 terms inside the parentheses, so I'm going to say Yes. Is A equal to 1? A is my first term's coefficient. A is not equal to 1. So I'm saying nope. Then we're going to follow our box method for finding a GCF for finding the factors after the GCF has already been taken out. So our box method, you can look at it right here while we're going. So our box method tells me I factored out the GCF. Now I need to draw my square. Once I have drawn my square, I need to put the first term in the upper left corner and the last term in the lower right corner. My first term is 2x squared. And my last term, my third term, is -7. Next, I'm multiplying the first and last terms. 2x squared times -7 gives me -14x squared. Next, I need to find two factors of the resulting product, so this -14x squared, whose sum is the middle term. So now we're thinking about this middle term. I want whatever factors I have to get -14x squared, I want them to add together to be -13x. So now I'm going to start listing some factors. Remember to try and think this through to be most efficient. If this is a negative number, that means that I have to have one negative and one positive number being multiplied by each other. I also know, because this is a negative number, that our negative number is larger than our positive number. So that's what I'm going to keep in mind when I start to list my factors. I'm going to start with -14 and 1. Remember to have your variable right beside it. What I'm going to notice here is I already figured it out, but just for the sake of the video and learning, let's list a couple more. Let's do -7x and 2x. And that's it. So looking at this, we know that it has to be -14x and 1x because those are our two that add to be -13x. So my next step is to place the factors in the two remaining squares. Then I'm going to find the GCF of each row and each column. This column, I like to move from left to right. So this column, I have 2x squared and -14x. So what they have in common is 2x. I have a 1x and a -7. All they have in common is 1. -14x and -7. I know that these have -7 in common. And 2x squared and 1x, I know that they just have x in common. And notice I put the negative sign here because these both have a negative sign, so we can mark this one negative. Now I'm just going to plug into the parentheses and determine each term's signs. So my parentheses will be like this. I know I have one term here, one term here. I'm going to start with my 2x and 1, and then my x and -7. And I'm just going to check my work to ensure that my signs are correct and I'm good to go. So 2x times x is 2x squared. Let me bring down that. 2x times negative 7 is negative 14x. Positive 1 times positive x is just x. 1 times negative 7 is negative 7. So everything looks good to go. It's safe to assume that this is a plus sign, and we have our two factors. So now we have finished step number 2. It's really important to know how to do this in order to complete these steps. The next part is pretty easy. All you have to do is set each factor equal to 0 and solve each individually for x. So my factors, I'm just going to rewrite them again. I've got 2, which actually just can go away in this case. 2x plus 1, x minus 7. So what I'm going to do is each of my factors, each group of parentheses needs to be individually set equal to 0. And I'm just going to solve for x like I normally do. Draw my line down the middle, subtract the constant from both sides. These cancel out. I'm going to bring down my 2x equals negative 1. Make that one match it. Divide by 2. And I get x equals negative 1/2. Then I'm also going to do that to the other side. Draw my line. Oops. Oh well. Add 7 to both sides to get rid of it. Bring down my x. X equals 7. So with quadratic equations, almost always you're going to have 2 values for x. And when we look at this on a graph, it'll make a little bit more sense. But right now, just know that you will almost always get 2 values for x. In order to check if I'm correct, I can plug these values into my original polynomial to ensure my answer is correct. So my original polynomial is 4x squared minus 26x equals 14. And I'm going to write that twice because I'm going to check both of these answers. 4x squared minus 26x equals 14. So what I mean by check my answers is I'm going to plug in this value for each of my x's. And I'm going to do that over here. And I can use a calculator for this point. So I'm going to say 4. Then I have my parentheses, negative 1/2 to the power of 2 minus 26. Negative 1/2 equals 14. So I know that this first one is correct. And then the other one, 4, plugging in 7 minus 26, 7 equals 14. So I've checked my work. And I know these 2 factors are my answers. So x equals negative 1/2 and 7.